Exposed. The secret he kept in plain sight. The morning Marcus left for his conference in Charlotte, I stood at our kitchen window in Buckhead and watched him load his garment bag into the back of his Audi like he'd done 100 times before. He kissed me on the cheek. He smelled like the cedar soap he always used. He told me not to work too late, and I laughed and said something about the pot calling the kettle black, and he smiled that slow, wide smile I'd fallen in love with 11 years ago in a graduate seminar on urban policy at Georgia Tech. Then he backed out of the driveway, and I poured myself a second cup of coffee, and I went back to my laptop, and that was that. Normal. Quiet. Ours. I want you to understand what our life looked like from the outside, because it matters to the rest of this story. We lived in a 4-bedroom Craftsman off West Paces Ferry Road. Not ostentatious, but comfortable. The kind of house that gets photographed for neighborhood real estate listings because the landscaping is good and the front porch has 2 rocking chairs that suggest a life lived thoughtfully. Marcus was a structural engineer with a firm downtown on Peachtree. I was a senior communications director for a nonprofit focused on affordable housing advocacy. We had a dog named Otis, a rescue mutt of indeterminate heritage who believed the couch was his personal property and tolerated our presence with great dignity. We had date nights on Fridays, usually at restaurants in Virginia Highland or Inman Park, the kind of places where you wait 3 weeks for a reservation and then feel vaguely guilty about the bill afterward. We had friends we actually liked. We had a marriage that people pointed to. I say all of this not to indulge nostalgia or pretend our life was without friction, because it wasn't. Marcus could be emotionally withholding in ways that sometimes made me feel like I was pressing my face against a fogged window, trying to see inside. I tended to throw myself so completely into my work that I'd surface weeks later and realize I'd been more present for a city council hearing than for my own husband. We had seasons of distance. We had arguments that didn't fully resolve, just faded until they felt small enough to step over. But I believed in us. I believed in the architecture of what we had built together, the way you believe in a bridge, not because you've inspected every bolt, but because it has held you safely every single time you've crossed it. The message came on a Tuesday. I was at my desk in our home office, the one we'd converted from what was supposed to be a guest room, surrounded by folders related to a zoning battle we were waging with the city over a proposed development in Vine City. It was just after 7 in the evening. The house was quiet except for Otis doing his slow patrol of the hallway, his nails clicking against the hardwood like a metronome. My phone buzzed with a notification from Instagram, which was unusual because I barely used it. My account was mostly dormant, just a few photos from the last couple of years, nothing I maintained with any intention. The notification said I had a direct message from someone I didn't follow. I almost ignored it. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I almost just let it sit there unopened. The account that messaged me had no profile photo. No posts. The username was a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing. The message itself was 4 sentences long, and I've since memorized them the way you involuntarily memorize the lyrics to a song you hate. I don't know how to say this to you, and I've gone back and forth for months about whether I should. But I think you deserve to know the truth. Your husband has been lying to you. I have proof, and I'll share it if you want it. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because nobody told me, and I wish they had. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after I read that. I could hear traffic on the road outside. Otis had settled at my feet. The city beyond our windows was doing what Atlanta always does at night, glittering and humming and moving with an energy that doesn't particularly care about your private disasters. I read the message 3 more times. Then I put my phone face down on my desk and stared at the wall. Here's what I want to tell you about the moment you receive information that could detonate your life. It doesn't feel dramatic. Not at first. There's no swelling music. There's no cinematic surge of emotion. What I felt was something closer to the sensation of touching a hot stove and pulling your hand back before your brain has fully processed what happened, that strange half-second of functional numbness before the pain arrives. I knew the message was significant. Some primitive, well-calibrated part of me registered it immediately. But my conscious mind was still running its regular programming, still composing a response to a city planner I'd been emailing, still thinking distantly about whether I'd taken the chicken out of the freezer for tomorrow. I picked my phone back up. I opened the message again. And then, because I am who I am, I started thinking analytically. Anonymous accounts are how people run harassment campaigns. Anonymous accounts are how bitter ex-girlfriends, or business competitors, or people with grudges and too much time insert chaos into someone else's life. I had no reason to trust this message. I had every reason to dismiss it. And yet I found myself typing back. "Who are you?" The reply came faster than I expected. "Someone who was in the same position you're in now, about 8 months ago. I know how this feels. I know you probably want to close this conversation and pretend you never saw it. You can do that. But if you want to talk, I'm here." I closed the app. I opened it again. I put the phone in my desk drawer. I took it back out. I finished my work email. I fed Otis. I poured a glass of wine I didn't really want and stood in our kitchen looking at the framed photo on the refrigerator, the one from our trip to Savannah 3 years ago where we're both laughing at something just outside the frame and we look genuinely, effortlessly happy. I thought about Marcus on the phone with me that morning, calling from his hotel, asking if I wanted him to bring back anything from that barbecue place on South Boulevard he knew I liked. Then I went back to my desk. I opened Instagram. And I typed, "Tell me what you know." She, because it was a she, her name was Danielle, spelled out over the course of the next 40 minutes, a story that I received in fragments, each one arriving like a slow, careful dismantling of something I'd built my life around. She told me she'd been involved with a man named Marcus Whitfield, a structural engineer based in Atlanta, for approximately 14 months. She said the relationship had presented itself to her as exclusive. She'd met him at a professional conference in Nashville the previous spring. He'd been attentive, consistent, communicative. He called. He visited. He made plans. She'd believed she was in a relationship with a single man. She found out the same way I was finding out now. Someone told her. The details she offered were not vague. They were the kind of specifics that you can't manufacture convincingly, a particular scar on his left forearm from a construction accident years ago. The way he always ordered his steak medium rare with a side request that wasn't on the menu. A habit he had of whistling under his breath when he was thinking hard. A birthmark. I knew about all of it. Every single detail landed in me like something being confirmed rather than introduced. By the end of that conversation, I was sitting on the floor of my home office with my back against the desk, and Otis pressed against my side, and the wine was untouched on the desk above me, and I was not crying. I was very, very still. I want to explain what it's like to have the story of your own marriage rewritten in real time, because I think people who haven't experienced it imagine it as a purely emotional event. A torrent of grief, a collapse. What I experienced was something more disorienting than that. It was epistemological. It was the sensation of watching the ground rearrange itself beneath your feet, of looking back at a landscape you've navigated confidently for years and realizing that the map you've been using was wrong. Every memory I had of Marcus was suddenly suspect. Not in the way of paranoid catastrophizing, but in the concrete, literal sense. I could not now be certain which of his conference trips were what he'd said they were. I could not be certain about the late nights, the unanswered texts, the moments of unexplained distraction. What had been 2 hours ago, the ordinary topography of a long marriage now looked entirely different. The same facts, rearranged by new information into a different picture. I stayed on the floor for a while. Then I got up. I washed my face. I let Otis out into the backyard, stood on the deck, and looked at the Atlanta skyline doing its glittering thing in the middle distance, all those lit windows representing all those other lives, and I made a decision. I was not going to react. Not yet. I was going to find out what was true. The next morning, I called into work with a vague mention of a migraine, which was not entirely false because my head had been pounding since around midnight. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, the old-fashioned way I think best, and I started writing down what I actually knew versus what I'd been told. This is a discipline I developed in my work, the ability to separate verified information from allegation, to resist the human tendency to treat a convincing narrative as equivalent to evidence. It was harder to apply that discipline to my own life and marriage, but I tried. What I knew, Marcus had been traveling for work regularly throughout our marriage, and his employer's HR records, if I could access them, would tell me whether those trips were logged. What I knew, he had a second phone. I'd noticed it once, about 6 months ago, sitting on the passenger seat of his car when I'd borrowed it for an errand. He'd explained it as a work phone his company had recently issued. I'd accepted that without question because it was a plausible explanation, and because I was not, at that time, a person who looked for reasons to doubt her husband. What I knew, there had been a period last winter, stretching roughly from October through January, when Marcus had seemed unusually preoccupied. I'd attributed it to a stressful project his firm was managing, a mixed-use development in Midtown that had run into structural complications. He'd talked about it enough that the explanation felt fully inhabited. What Danielle had told me, she had photographs. Not compromising photographs, she'd been careful to clarify. Still, photographs of them together at restaurants, at events, at what she described as a weekend trip to Asheville that Marcus had taken in November, a weekend I remembered because he'd told me it was a colleague's bachelor trip. She offered to send them. I'd told her I needed some time before I looked at anything. That was still true the next morning. I wasn't ready for images. Images would make it irreversible in a way that words hadn't quite managed yet. What I did instead was drive downtown. Marcus's firm occupied the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Center Avenue, all glass and steel with a lobby that had the aggressively neutral aesthetic of places designed to impress without committing to a personality. I had been there dozens of times over the years. I knew the receptionist by name. I wasn't going to walk in and make a scene. That was never a consideration, but I wanted to be in proximity to the physical reality of his professional life. I parked in a deck across the street and sat in my car with a coffee I'd picked up from a place on Auburn Avenue. I watched people come and go from the building's entrance for about 20 minutes before I understood that I wasn't going to learn anything useful this way, and that what I was actually doing was struggling to believe this was real and hoping that proximity to the ordinary facts of his life would somehow dispel it. It didn't. I drove home. I opened my laptop. And I began, methodically and with the same careful attention I would give to any research project, to look. I want to be honest about what I found and how I found it, because I think there's a version of this story where the narrator becomes someone else during this process, someone harder or more brittle, someone who loses themselves in the investigation. That didn't happen to me, or not exactly. What I became was focused. I went through our shared credit card statements for the past 18 months, which I had access to because we'd always managed our finances jointly. I was looking for anomalies, charges at restaurants or hotels in cities where his stated travel didn't account for his presence. I found a dinner charge in Nashville in April of last year. A hotel in Asheville in November, charged to a card that was listed on our account as a secondary card Marcus used for business expenses. And a modest recurring charge of $22 a month to a service I didn't recognize, which, after a quick search, turned out to be a photo storage platform. None of this was proof of an affair. All of it was consistent with Danielle's account. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called my closest friend, Renee, who'd known me since our undergraduate years at Spelman and who, in my opinion, had one of the finest analytical minds I knew outside an academic setting. I didn't tell her everything. I told her I had a situation I needed to think through out loud and asked if I could come over. She said yes without asking questions, which is one of the many reasons I've loved her for 20 years. Renee lives in Decatur, in a house she's renovated incrementally over the past decade into something that's both orderly and warm. She made tea. She sat across from me at her kitchen table, and she listened without interrupting. At the same time, I laid out everything, starting with the Instagram message and ending with the credit card statements and the photo storage platform. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me right now? Do you need me to help you think, or do you need me just to be here?" I told her I needed to think. She said, "Okay, then let's think." What Renee helped me see over the next 2 hours was that I had a choice to make before I made any other choice. I could confront Marcus with what I had now, which was suggestive but not airtight, and risk a conversation where he could plausibly deny or explain away each piece. Or I could keep gathering information until I had something that didn't leave room for alternate interpretations. Or I could contact Danielle again and ask to see what she had. Or I could do none of those things and decide, based on what I already knew, what I believed, and what I wanted to do about it. "What does your gut say?" Renee asked. I'd been avoiding that question all morning. My gut had been saying the same thing since 7:15 the previous evening, since the first message, before I knew any of the specifics. My gut had recognized something in the initial message that my brain had been working very hard to interrogate, qualify, and resist. My gut said, "This is true." I drove home. I opened Instagram. I told Danielle I was ready to see what she had. She sent me 12 photographs. I looked at all of them, alone at my kitchen table, while Otis slept under my chair. In several of them, Marcus was clearly identifiable. In several of them, Danielle was present. In 2 of them, they were together in a way that communicated, beyond any ambiguity I was capable of manufacturing, the nature of their relationship. They were not photographs of 2 colleagues at a conference dinner. They were photographs of 2 people who were, or believed themselves to be, in a relationship. I closed my laptop. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The light was changing, the afternoon moving toward evening, and Atlanta outside my windows was starting to do its golden hour thing, the way the light hits the tree canopy over the neighborhoods of the northwest side, making everything look briefly like a painting. I thought about the 11 years. I thought about the Savannah photograph on the refrigerator. I thought about the way Marcus had kissed my cheek that morning, unhurried and warm, the way he'd smelled like cedar soap. Then I picked up my phone and called him. He answered on the second ring, his voice easy and familiar, and he asked how my day was going. I told him it had been a long one. I told him I missed him. He said he'd be home on Thursday. I said okay. I told him I loved him. He said he loved me too. And then I said goodnight, set my phone down, and sat in the gathering dark of my kitchen, letting myself feel, for the first time since the message arrived, the full weight of what I was carrying. I cried for about an hour. Not dramatic, not the kind of crying you see performed in films. The quiet, sustained kind, the kind that has more to do with grief than with shock, the kind that acknowledges loss rather than resisting it. I cried for the marriage I had believed I had. I cried for the version of Marcus I'd known and loved and built a life with, because even if that version had been incomplete or constructed in part from my own willingness to see what I wanted to see, my experience of loving him had been real. Grief doesn't wait for the full picture before it arrives. I cried because I didn't know yet what came next, and not knowing felt enormous. When I was done, I washed my face again. I let Otis out. I made dinner. I went to bed. And I lay in the dark on my side of a bed that still held the slight impression of a man I'd slept next to for 11 years, and I planned what I was going to do when he came home. Marcus came home Thursday evening around 7, dropping his bag in the entryway the way he always did, a habit that had annoyed me for years and that I now noticed with a strange, detached clarity. The way you become hyper-aware of the details of something you know is about to change. He smelled like the same cedar soap. He hugged me, asked about my week, said he was starving, and asked if I'd eaten. I'd made pasta, enough for 2, which was either a gesture of normalcy or a kind of unconscious grace I wasn't fully in control of. We sat at our dining table, ate, and talked about his project and a grant application I was working on. I listened to myself participate in this conversation with a remove that felt almost clinical, some part of me hovering slightly above the scene, watching. I had decided, in the 2 days between his call and his return, that I was not going to explode. I had decided that I was going to have a real conversation, not a confrontation in the dramatic sense, but a conversation in which I told him what I knew and asked him to tell me the truth. I'd thought carefully about why that mattered to me, and I'd arrived at this, because I had spent 11 years in a relationship with this man. I believed I was owed the truth delivered with some dignity, not extracted in a scene because I wanted to hear what he said when there was nowhere left to go except toward honesty. And because some part of me, the part that had loved him for 11 years, needed to be in the room when it happened. After dinner, I cleared the table. I poured 2 glasses of water, set them between us, sat back down, and said, "I need to talk to you about something serious." He looked at me with that attentiveness he had, leaning forward slightly, and he said, "Okay." I told him about the message. I watched his face as I described it. He went very still. I told him I'd spoken with Danielle. I told him I'd seen the photographs. I kept my voice level. I didn't perform calmly. I was calm in the way that you can sometimes be calm when the worst has already happened, and what remains is just the formality of naming it. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then he said, "Layla." My name in his mouth, spoken that way, with that particular weight, told me everything before he said another word. What followed was not a denial. I want to be clear about that because the denial is often what people expect, the first line of defense, the reflexive no that buys time. Marcus did not deny it. What he did, after a long moment in which I could see him making an internal decision, was to start talking. And what came out was not an explanation that made it better, because nothing could, but it was the truth, and it was more complicated than I'd been prepared for, even after everything I already knew. He told me it had started at that conference in Nashville. He told me he hadn't intended for it to turn out the way it did. He told me Danielle hadn't known about me initially, not at first, and that by the time she did know, or partially knew, things had already developed in ways he hadn't managed well. He used the word compartmentalized, which is what people use when they mean lied to everyone, including myself. He told me he had been going to end it. He told me he was sorry. He looked at me across the table in our dining room in our house in Buckhead with those familiar eyes, and he told me he was sorry, and I believed him, and it didn't change anything. I asked him one question that I'd been carrying since Tuesday. I asked him whether he had loved her. He took a long time to answer. Then he said he didn't know. He said it had been something he hadn't let himself fully examine. I sat with that answer and understood that it was probably the most honest thing he could have given me, and that it was an admission that the situation had been more than a physical betrayal, which was its own kind of grief, arriving on top of the one already there. We talked for a long time. Not fighting, not performing, just talking. At some point, Otis came and sat between us, the way he did when he sensed something heavy in the room, and neither of us acknowledged him, but I put my hand on his back and felt better for the solid warmth of it. I asked Marcus questions, and he answered them. Not all of his answers were satisfying. Some of them were the answers of a person still in the process of understanding their own behavior, which is its own kind of honesty. I didn't cry. I had done my crying. What I felt was something more like the strange, exhausted clarity that comes after a long illness break. By 11 o'clock, I told him I needed him to stay somewhere else for a while. I told him I didn't yet know what that meant for us in the long term, and I wasn't going to pretend to know. He asked if he could call a friend. I said yes. He packed a bag, the same garment bag he'd taken to Charlotte, and before he left, he stood in the hallway and looked at me and said my name again. I told him I'd be in touch. He nodded. The door closed. Otis and I stood in the quiet hallway of our house, and I listened to his car back out of the driveway, and then I went to the kitchen, made chamomile tea, and sat at the table in the specific silence of a house that has just been rearranged by truth. The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life, not because they were dramatic, but because they weren't. I went to work. I attended meetings. I argued effectively, I'm told, in a city council session about the Vine City development. I took Otis on his walks through the neighborhood in the mornings. I watched the Atlanta spring doing its extravagant best, dogwood and wisteria rioting along the sidewalks, the air warm and pollen heavy and entirely indifferent to private catastrophe. I talked to Renee. I talked to my sister in Charlotte, who cried more than I did and whose reaction I found oddly stabilizing. I did not talk to Marcus, not for the first 2 weeks, except for a single logistical exchange about some mail he was expecting. And I thought, which is what I do when things get hard. I thought about the marriage, about what had been real within it, and what had been constructed from selective attention. I thought about the ways I had participated in the distance between us, the periods when I'd been so absorbed in my work that I'd treated our relationship like a stable background condition rather than something that required active presence. I am not saying that any of this caused what Marcus did. It didn't, and the responsibility for his choices was entirely his. But I was interested in what was true, not just about him but about us, and the truth was that we had both, for different reasons and in different ways, been somewhere else at times when we should have been with each other. I want to say something here that might be uncomfortable for some of you to hear, because it was uncomfortable for me to arrive at. Grief and anger are both appropriate responses to betrayal. I felt both, but the most important thing I did in those first weeks was refuse to let either of them become the entirety of my response. Not because I was performing emotional sophistication, but because I am a person who believes in trying to see things clearly, and clear sight requires a wider aperture than anger alone allows. About 3 weeks after Marcus left, I contacted Danielle. This was not something Renee initially supported. Her position, which was reasonable and came from love, was that I had already gotten from Danielle everything I needed, that she had done me a genuine service by telling me what she knew. That further contact carried risks I didn't need, emotional entanglement, competing narratives, and the possibility of someone else's pain becoming tangled with my own in ways that would complicate my healing. All of that was fair. I heard it. And then I contacted Danielle anyway, because I had been thinking about something she'd written in one of her early messages. Nobody told me, and I wish they had. I met her at a coffee shop in Midtown on a Wednesday afternoon. I knew her from the photographs, so I recognized her when she came through the door, a few years younger than me, with natural hair pulled back, dressed in the composed way of someone who'd spent some effort on appearing unaffected. She recognized me, too, or recognized the situation. When she sat down across from me, there was a moment of mutual acknowledgement of the profound strangeness of what we were doing, two women meeting over coffee to compare notes on the man who had deceived them both. We talked for almost 2 hours. I learned things in that conversation that I hadn't known and that helped me understand, not forgive, not excuse, but understand, the architecture of how it had happened. I learned that Marcus had been more deliberate in his construction of the parallel life than I'd understood him to be, careful about which weekends he visited her, careful about the details he shared. Careful in the way that suggests not a spontaneous affair, but something maintained with genuine effort. That was harder to hear than almost anything else. The effort implied intention in a way that impulsive passion doesn't. Danielle told me she had ended contact with Marcus the same week she messaged me. She said she had done it not because she'd been told to or because she felt guilty, though she did, she said, feel guilty, but because she was not willing to continue in a relationship she now fully understood to have been built on her ignorance. She said this without drama, plainly, and I found myself respecting it. She was someone who had also been lied to, who had also trusted someone who hadn't deserved it, and she had made a clean decision. I understood that. I thanked her for reaching out. She said she almost hadn't. She said she'd written and deleted the message more times than she could count over the course of months. I told her I was glad she sent it. I told her that I meant it. We didn't become friends. I want to be honest about that because I've heard stories where this kind of meeting becomes the foundation of a meaningful connection, and maybe for some people it does, but for us, it was something more specific and bounded. It was two people acknowledging each other's reality in a moment when both of us needed to be seen clearly by someone who understood the full picture. We finished our coffee. We parted. I don't know what happened to her afterward, except that I hope she's well. Marcus and I began to talk again about 6 weeks after he left. Carefully at first, by phone, then in person at a neutral location, a quieter place. A Ponce City market restaurant on a slow Tuesday afternoon where we could speak without being overheard and where the relative anonymity of a public space kept things from tipping into territory neither of us was ready for. He had been seeing a therapist, which he told me not as a bid for credit, but as a factual matter. I had been seeing one too, a woman in Inman Park who specialized in relationship trauma and who had a quietly effective way of helping me locate my own thinking without leading me anywhere she thought I should go. What Marcus and I had in those conversations was not a reconciliation. I want to be careful not to create that impression. We had a reckoning. We talked about the marriage with a thoroughness and honesty that we had never managed before, which is one of the grim ironies of crisis. It sometimes produces a quality of communication that normal life doesn't. He told me things about his own loneliness within our marriage that I hadn't known, not because they justified anything, but because I asked him to be honest, and he was. I told him things about my own distance, my absorption in work, the ways I'd sometimes treated our relationship as a fixed point rather than something that needed to be tended. These weren't confessions of wrongdoing. They were accounts of how two people can love each other and still leave each other in ways that, over time, create the kind of space where bad things can happen. I am telling you this because I think it matters. Because I think the story of a betrayal is often told as a story about one person's failure, and sometimes that's true. But the story of a marriage is never that simple, and pretending otherwise doesn't serve anyone trying to understand their own life. What I decided, eventually, after 4 months of living apart and talking carefully and working through things with my therapist and with Renee and with my own interior landscape, is that I did not want to rebuild this marriage. I want to be clear that this was a decision made with clarity rather than anger. I was not punishing Marcus. I was not performing independence or making a statement. I was honestly looking at what we had, what it would take to rebuild it, and who I was and who I wanted to be. And I understood that the person I was becoming through this experience was someone who needed a different kind of future than the one we'd been building. That took time to arrive at. It didn't arrive in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. It arrived slowly, the way most important things do. Marcus and I filed for divorce in the fall. We used a mediator rather than going to litigation, which was Renee's suggestion and the right one. It was not without pain. The dissolution of 11 years is not without pain, but we moved through it with a respect for each other and for what we'd shared that I think we both needed to close it well. He kept the car. I kept the house with a buyout arrangement. We agreed on what to do with the joint financial accounts. Otis, who had opinions about none of this except that he required his dinner at 6 and his walk at 7 regardless of the emotional weather, stayed with me. On the day we signed the final paperwork, sitting across a conference table in a downtown office building not far from where Marcus worked, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, a kind of quiet respect for both of us. We had arrived here without destroying each other. We had been, in the end, honest. And we had managed something that I know many people in similar situations do not, to see each other as human beings navigating a painful situation rather than as enemies inflicting injury upon one another. He shook my hand after we signed. I held his hand for a moment, and I looked at him, really looked at him, and I thought about the 11 years, about the graduate seminar and the Savannah photograph and the cedar soap and Otis pressing himself between us that night at the dining table. I thought about the fact that loving someone and choosing to leave them are not mutually exclusive, and never have been. Then I picked up my bag and walked out into Atlanta on a clear October afternoon, the sky the particular shade of blue it gets in the fall down here, and I went home. Here's what nobody tells you about the aftermath of a life being taken apart and rebuilt. It is, in many of its ordinary moments, fine. Not in the performing fineness way, not in the "I'm okay" you say to people at work who ask how you're doing and don't actually want the full answer, but genuinely, surprisingly fine. The grief is real, and it moves through you on its own schedule, arriving sometimes in the middle of a Tuesday when something small triggers a memory, the cedar soap smell in a store, a song, a restaurant you went to once. You feel it, let it pass, and move on. That is not a tragedy. That is living. I stayed in the house for about 8 months after the divorce was final. Then I moved. Not because the house was unhappy. It was a good house and had held a lot of genuine living, but because I was ready for the architecture of my life to match the interior reality of it. I found an apartment in Ponce Highland, on the top floor of a building with tall windows and a small balcony, where Otis could surveil the neighborhood with the gravity he believed the role demanded. It was smaller than the house. It was mine. I want to talk, for a few minutes, about what I learned. Not in the way of a listicle, not 10 tips for surviving betrayal, because I find that reductive, and it didn't match my experience. But there are things I understand now that I didn't understand before, and I think they're worth saying. The first is about trust. Not the advice column version of trust, The idea that you should extend it freely until proven wrong or withhold it defensively until proven safe. Something more specific, that trust in an intimate relationship is not one thing. It is a collection of small perceptions accumulated over time. Some of those perceptions can be accurate, and some can be filtered through your own need to believe something, and learning to distinguish between them is hard, ongoing work. I had trusted Marcus, and my trust had not been entirely misplaced because many of the things I trusted about him were real. But I had also extended trust in the direction of not asking questions, because the answers to some questions felt threatening, and there is a difference between trust and avoidance. I understand that difference now, not just in my head. The second thing is about the particular loneliness of carrying a secret you haven't yet decided what to do with. The days between the message and Marcus coming home were some of the loneliest of my life, not because I was physically alone, but because I was living in a version of reality that nobody around me could see. Renee helped, but even she couldn't fully enter that space with me. What I know now is that this is why people talk to strangers on the internet, why confession has such a long history, why anonymous accounts like Danielle's reach out across the silence, because the weight of an unshared truth is its own specific kind of suffering. The third thing is about anger, and this one I want to get right because I've seen it gotten wrong a lot. Anger is a reasonable, healthy, appropriate response to being lied to and betrayed by someone who committed to you. It is not something to manage away, perform in the past, or move through too quickly because you want to appear emotionally evolved. I felt anger. I let myself feel it. What I tried to do, and mostly succeeded at, was not let it become the organizing principle of how I processed everything else, not because I was required to forgive or to protect Marcus's feelings or to perform graciousness, but because I had watched enough people organize their lives around bitterness to understand that it costs more than it's worth. Forgiveness is a complicated word, and I want to be careful with it. I did not, in the first months, forgive Marcus. I don't think I was supposed to, and anyone who told me I should have moved faster toward forgiveness was, with respect, prioritizing their own comfort with my emotional situation over my actual well-being. What happened over time, as I worked through things with my therapist and with my own thinking, was something more gradual, a release of the need for his suffering to be proportional to mine. That is not the same as forgiveness, but it is, I think, a prerequisite for it, and it was the most useful emotional work I did in that period. The fourth thing is about the shape of help, and this one is for Danielle as much as for anyone. She could have stayed silent. Many people in her position do, because reaching out is risky, uncomfortable, and carries its own emotional cost. She chose not to. I think about that decision and what it required of her, to contact a stranger with information that would disrupt that stranger's life, to make herself vulnerable to anger, disbelief, or dismissal, to sit with the uncertainty of not knowing how I'd respond. That is a courageous thing to do. It is courageous to tell someone the truth they haven't asked to hear because you believe they deserve to know it. I am glad she did it. I try to remember that kind of courage when I encounter situations in my own life that call for honesty. There is one more thing I want to say, and it is this. I am not a cautionary tale. I want to be clear about that. My life did not become small or cautious or defined by what happened. If anything, it became clearer. The experience of having a version of your life dismantled by truth turns out to be, when you survive it, instructive. It taught me what I actually valued and what I'd been maintaining out of habit or fear. It taught me that I was more resilient than I'd known. It taught me that the people who showed up for me during that period, Renee, my sister, my therapist, even Danielle in her particular way, were showing me something about the quality of connection that was available to me, and that the quality of my life going forward depended more on that kind of connection than on any single relationship or any particular arrangement of domestic happiness. I live now in my apartment in Ponce Highland. I run the same nonprofit, and I'm good at it. We won the Vine City battle, by the way, which felt like a significant personal victory in a year that needed one. I take Otis to Piedmont Park on Saturday mornings and watch him approach other dogs with the regal condescension he has developed into an art form. I have dinner with Renee on Thursdays. I am learning to cook things I never had the patience for when I was always working. I have started running again, which I did in college and abandoned. The feeling of running through the Atlanta morning, through neighborhoods that are simultaneously ancient and reinventing themselves. That feeling of moving through something complicated and beautiful and unresolved feels right. I have not remarried. I have dated carefully and with the kind of attention to my own interior weather that I didn't always pay before. I have been in a relationship for about 7 months with someone I am not going to describe in detail because some things are still mine. What I will say is that I entered it differently than I've entered relationships before, more attentive, more willing to ask hard questions, more present. I don't know where it goes. I've learned to be more comfortable with not knowing. There is a moment that comes back to me sometimes, and I'll end with it. It's not the moment I received the message. It's not the confrontation at the dining table, or the conversation with Danielle, or the day I signed the divorce papers. It was a morning, maybe 2 months after Marcus left, when I woke up early and couldn't get back to sleep. I made coffee, and I went out onto the back deck of the house, still mine at that point, and I sat in one of the rocking chairs in the gray pre-dawn dark. Otis came and lay at my feet. Atlanta was beginning to stir. The distant hum of the connector, a bird somewhere in the pines, the sky going from black to the particular deep blue that precedes sunrise by about 20 minutes. And I sat there in the quiet, and I felt, underneath the grief and the uncertainty and the long work of rebuilding still ahead, something that I can only describe as the satisfaction of being exactly where I was, exactly who I was. Not the person I'd been inside the marriage, and not yet whoever I was becoming, but precisely myself in the middle of the process of finding out. That was nothing. That was, in fact, everything. And I think that's what truth does, when you let it. It strips things down to what's actually there. It hurts, often significantly. But what's left when the constructions fall away is something solid. It's yours, and you can build from it. The end.